Day 9. You know the game Battleship, where you sit on opposite sides of a screen and you try to sink the other guy's ships by guessing what grid coordinates they're at? Imagine how frustrating that game can be when your opponent takes all of his ships off the grid without telling you. That is pretty much how the US military feels on October 24th, 1962, as their naval blockade on Cuba goes into effect. This is Time Goes to Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm Indy Neidell. Yesterday, the Soviet top brass met for the first time to discuss the crisis. They decided to not provoke the US openly by sailing through the blockade line, but to still keep their nuclear missiles on Cuba and run the line with 4 Foxtrot-class nuclear-armed submarines. American President John F. Kennedy spent the whole day dealing with the details of how to get the blockade in place politically and how to enforce it militarily. He was worried about political fallout for having acted so late in the day, and Attorney General Robert Kennedy was pessimistic about the effects of the blockade.
The question that I've heard raised rather extensively is that why this was not uncovered sooner, when there were some reports about it, why we didn't know about it. Therefore, why a blockade of some kind was not instituted earlier. And whether this, second question, whether what we are doing now is in fact closing the barn door after the forces go on. And those questions that will be raised.
Well, that ties into Senator Keating's frequent statements. I'm having Senator Keating's statements analyzed. Actually, they're quite inaccurate. He made a statement 2 days ago that it was being built there pads which would be ready for firing in the United States in 6 months. So his information was, he had a piece of it, but it was not precise. But nevertheless, that is going to be. Now, it seems to me that somebody in a responsible position ought to take up this question. I don't think that it's realized how quickly these mobile bases can be set up and how quickly they can be moved. So that I'm just wondering now what is the judgment of the best means of getting this point over. View of the next 24 hours, there'll be some spraying all around.
At 2 p.m. Greenwich time, so 10 a.m. in Washington, D.C., October 24th, 1962, the blockade of Cuba goes into effect. The President and ExComm, the National Security Committee dealing with the crisis, are now huddled up in the White House monitoring developments. The atmosphere is tense as they wait to see what the Soviets will do. One concern is what to do about submarines if they are caught breaking the blockade. How do you get them to surface?
To meet this exact situation, we have depth charges that have such a small charge that they can be dropped and they can actually hit the submarine without damaging the submarine. These are practice depth charges. We propose to use those as warning depth charges. The message that Alex is talking about states that when our forces come upon an unidentified submarine, we will ask it to come to the surface for inspection by transmitting the following signals using a depth charge of this type and also using certain sonar signals which they may not be able to accept and interpret. And therefore it is the depth charge that is the warning notice and the instruction to surface.
This is a very dangerous operation and can easily end up sinking the submarine or provoking a response, a nuclear response. Later in the day, Robert Kennedy will write down that these few minutes were the time of greatest worry by the president. His hand went up to his face and covered his mouth, and he closed his fist. His eyes were tense, almost gray, and we just stared at each other across the table. They debate the danger of the proposed anti-submarine actions until CIA Director McCone interrupts that conversation.
Mr. President, I have a note just handed to me that says that just received information through ONI that all 6 Soviet ships currently identified in Cuban waters, and I don't know what that means, have either stopped or reversed course.
What do you mean? What do you mean, Cuban waters?
Well, I don't know.
It's the ships heading towards the blockade that are being referred to. The sudden message is a bit strange, though, as we'll see in a moment. Now, A lot has been made over the years of this being the moment when the US and the USSR stood eyeball to eyeball and the other fellow just flinched as the Russian ships approached the line and seemingly turn around at the last moment. The eyeball quote is attributed to Secretary of State Dean Rusk, who whispers it to National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy. Apparently he does do this, but there was never an eyeball moment here. The Russian ships, with the military equipment on board, were already ordered to turn back or to stop 24 hours ago. Rusk does not know this though, and it's interesting to see why he does not know this. During the past 24 hours, you'd think that the US Air Force and Navy would have noticed, given that they have now positioned 12 destroyers along a 500-mile arc stretching east of to northwest of Cuba. There's an aircraft carrier group south of Cuba. Several submarines patrol the waters. Dozens of planes and a bunch of smaller ships monitor the Soviet cargo vessels. The fact is, they did notice already on the 23rd. But for some reason, the Air Force and the Navy choose not to report this to XCOM. Now, we cannot be sure of why the Joint Chiefs of Staff did not report it. We do know that they are opposed to the blockade and for a harder confrontation, especially U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff General Curtis LeMay, one of the recipients of the report that the blockade is seemingly being respected. Then again, maybe the chief's observations were just inconclusive. A few words about Curtis LeMay here. He directed the firebombing campaign on Japan in 1945 that killed some 500,000 civilians and left millions more homeless. So he is no stranger to offensive war. He also was furious that he was not allowed to nuke North Korea. In fact, they literally had to lock up the nukes to prevent him from using them. So he carpet-bombed urban areas and dams, destroying agriculture and causing famine. He and JFK loathe each other. So anyhow, does this mean that the crisis is now over, only the president and his men just haven't noticed yet? Far from it. This is the beginning. First of all, do not forget those 4 nuclear-armed Soviet submarines that are not turning around. Second of all, there is the issue of the Soviets removing their missiles from Cuba. Khrushchev has penned a strongly worded letter Kennedy is about to receive. The letter does not concede anything though, and does not even acknowledge the existence of the missiles. He writes, "You are doing all this not only out of hatred for the Cuban people and its government, but also because of considerations of the election campaign in the United States. What morality, what law can justify such an approach by the American government to international affairs? No such morality or law can be found, because the actions of the United States with regard to Cuba constitute outright banditry, or if you like, the folly of degenerate imperialism." He gives the US leadership good reason to believe that the blockade will not be respected. The Soviet government considers that the violation of the freedom to use international waters and international airspace is an act of aggression which pushes mankind towards the abyss of a world nuclear missile war. Therefore, the Soviet government cannot instruct the captains of Soviet vessels bound for Cuba to observe the orders of American naval forces blockading that island. Our instructions to Soviet mariners are to observe strictly the universally accepted norms of navigation in international waters and not to retreat one step from them. It's a partial bluff, but he also goes from veiled threats to direct promises of retaliation. Naturally, we will not simply be bystanders with regard to piratical acts by American ships on the high seas. We will then be forced on our part to take the measures we consider necessary and adequate in order to protect our rights. We have everything necessary to do so. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy has stepped up another action that will further escalate the situation. So far, CIA-operated U-2 high-altitude planes have been furnishing photographic evidence of the missile buildup. But it's been a sore spot with XCOM since the start of the crisis that these photos are so difficult to analyze, do not furnish proof that is understandable to a layman, and are not precise enough to identify how close the missiles are to being ready. Until the crisis was made public, they refrained from low-altitude recon flights, as this would first of all be really dangerous, and second of all, force things to become public right away. But yesterday, Captain William Ecker and his wingman, Lieutenant Bruce Wilhelmy, made the first low-altitude flights. Now, this is real Top Gun-style flight stunts we're talking here, except they have no guns, only cameras on board. They're flying in RF-8 Crusaders. That is the unarmed recon version of the F-8 Crusader, and to make really clear photos, they have to fly really low. Really, really low. And to not get shot down, they have to fly fast. Really, really fast. They take off from Jacksonville, Florida, and head for Cuba at their regular flight altitude. As they approach the island, though, they take the planes down to just 400 feet over the ocean, flying at 400 miles per hour. As they fly in over Cuba, they are certain to be detected. A fighter jet roaring by only 25 stories above your head is hard to miss, right? Ecker and Wilhelmy are heading for the missiles at San Cristobal. As they scream over the site, Cuban and Russian soldiers scramble for their guns. One picture even reveals a Cuban soldier tripping out of an outhouse with his trousers still around his knees. The pilots snap their cameras, capturing crystal clear images of the site. When they're already out of range, they see the smoke puffs of the anti-aircraft artillery behind them. In total, it takes them under 4 minutes to fly over Cuba, but they're not out of danger. Ecker will remember. Then it got kind of hectic. We were flying right into the granddaddy of all thunderstorms. We're talking a wall of clouds rising to 50,000, 60,000 feet. Here I've got the pictures, and if the airplane gets busted all to pieces, it wouldn't do anybody any good. At the last second, I see a jet-sized hole open up in the clouds. It was just a sunspot. I said, "Burners now." We popped out the top. When he returns to base, he's not even allowed to leave his plane. He's ordered to fly straight to Washington. There, to his astonishment, he's debriefed at the Pentagon directly by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Taylor, and several of the other chiefs. Ecker has taken off his pressure suit, and underneath his uniform is wet with sweat. He apologizes. One of the generals takes his cigar out of his mouth and says, "You're a pilot. You're supposed to be goddamn sweaty." Curtis LeMay is fuming at the Navy for having upstaged his Air Force, and later, when the pilots are decorated for the action during a White House event, LeMay will refuse to take part in the ceremony, remaining in his limousine, pouting and chomping on his cigar. In any case, President Kennedy and Ambassador to the UN Adlai Stevenson now have the photographic evidence they need to confront the Soviets. But they also now know that several of the nuclear missiles are ready and can be fired at short notice. Robert Kennedy was right. What we are doing now is, in fact, closing the barn door after the horse is gone. The blockade has not resolved anything, and instead, the world has taken yet another few steps towards nuclear war. The U.S. Strategic Command is now taken to defense readiness level DEFCON 2, the final stage before imminent nuclear war. See you on the 9th day of the crisis, when the showdown continues. If you missed our episode where the U-2 spy planes are explained in detail, you can find it right here. And do not forget to subscribe, and please support us at patreon.com or timeghost.tv so that we can make more awesome history. Good night, and good luck.